My son called me from jail, and the man who put him there was eating Sunday dinner with us 3 nights earlier. That is the part I still cannot say calmly. Ethan was 31 years old, sitting in a county holding cell, accused of stealing from the company that belonged to his wife's father. His voice did not sound angry. It sounded broken, like a grown man trying not to let his own dad hear him fall apart. "Dad," he said, "I didn't do this." I believed him before he finished the sentence. Because I knew my son, I knew the man who showed up early, stayed late, helped strangers, and apologized when other people failed him. And I also knew Grant Whitaker, the polished, quiet father-in-law, who never raised his voice because men like him do not need volume to destroy someone. He thought arresting my son would teach him his place. He thought I was just a retired banker with nothing left but old stories and a coffee mug. What Grant did not know was that, 12 years earlier, I had signed one document that could take his entire company out of his hands with one quiet move. Before I tell you what Grant Whitaker did to my son, you need to understand who Ethan Mercer was before anybody put handcuffs on him. Because when a man gets accused of stealing, people start doing math in their heads. They look at his truck, his mortgage, his boots, the hours he works, the way he carries himself. They start asking whether maybe they missed something. Maybe he was desperate. Maybe he was bitter. Maybe he crossed a line. That is how reputations die, quietly. In the space between accusation and truth, Ethan was not a thief. He was the kind of man who showed up at the freight terminal before sunrise, because refrigerated trucks do not care if a person is tired. At 5:20 in the morning, while Knoxville was dark, Ethan would be walking the loading lanes with a clipboard tucked under his arm, checking temperature seals, dock schedules, fuel levels, and tire pressure before the drivers rolled toward Atlanta, Nashville, Charlotte, wherever the load had to be by noon. He was not management in the way men like Grant used that word. He did not stand behind glass and point at people. He put on gloves. He climbed into trailers. He helped move pallets when someone's back went out. If a new driver got turned around near the interstate, Ethan was the one answering before dispatch knew there was a problem. There was a man there named Hank Rollins. Hank had driven cold freight for 26 years, and he had the kind of face carved by cigarette smoke and highway wind. One Thursday morning, Hank had a heart scare in the parking lot. Chest pain, gray skin, one hand gripping the mirror of his cab like he was trying to hold himself upright by force. Ethan did not wait for somebody to make it official. He rode with Hank to Park Ridge Medical Center, called Hank's wife from the ambulance, and sat in that waiting room for 7 hours with vending machine coffee going cold in his hand. He did not mention it to me or Nora. I found out weeks later when Hank's wife stopped me outside a hardware store and said, "Your boy stayed until they told me he was stable." Your boy. That was how people talked about Ethan when he was not around. At work, he gave up lunch breaks to train the new hires nobody wanted. The young guys who came in thinking logistics was just scanners and trucks learned fast that it was patience, memory, sweat, and knowing which driver needed 30 seconds of respect before he would listen. Ethan corrected people without making them feel small. That is rarer than people think. Every other Saturday, he drove 45 minutes out of his way to help Mrs. Bellamy, an elderly widow from our old neighborhood, carry groceries up 3 flights of stairs. Her building had no elevator, and her knees had gone bad after a fall the winter before. She tried paying him once with a $20 bill folded into a church bulletin. Ethan handed it back. "Save it for peach cobbler," he told her. She laughed about that for months. Those are small things. I know. Nobody writes newspaper stories about a man who fixes a neighbor's porch rail or waits with an old driver's wife in a hospital hallway. Nobody puts decency on a performance review. But small things are where character hides before life gets ugly enough to test it. And life was about to get ugly. My name is Malcolm Mercer. I was 60 years old when this happened. Though my knees suggested more, I had spent 34 years in commercial banking, mostly in credit risk and business lending. I knew what made a company healthy. I knew what made it rotten. I knew how debt could save a business, and how debt could put a quiet hand around a man's throat if he forgot who held the paper. I retired 3 years before Ethan called from that cell. Retired is a generous word. I still did a consulting from a small office behind my house on Cedar Hollow Road, helping family-owned businesses untangle cash flow before the bank got tired of waiting. It was quiet work. Numbers, contracts, collateral files, work people respect after it is too late. I had a good wife, a sturdy house, a grill I used too often, and one flaw I had mistaken for wisdom. I thought giving my son space meant respecting him. Ethan had grown into a man who did not ask for help easily. So I trained myself not to offer it unless he asked. I told myself that was dignity. I told myself a father should not crowd a grown man's life. I would listen, nod, give advice if he opened the door first, but I stayed on my side of the line. For years, I thought that made me decent. Then I heard my son's voice through a jail phone, trying not to break, and I understood something I should have known much sooner. Sometimes the line you refuse to cross is the exact place your child needed you standing. 3 years before that phone call, Ethan married Nora Whitaker. Nora was the kind of woman who could walk into a room full of stiff people and make everybody breathe again. Warm laugh, quick eyes, sharp mind. She taught science in Knoxville and could explain thunderstorms to 12-year-olds in a way that made even the troublemakers sit forward. Ethan loved that about her. I did too. Her father was Grant Whitaker. Grant owned Whitaker Cold Chain Logistics, a mid-size refrigerated trucking company that ran produce, meat, medicine, and anything else that had to stay cold from Tennessee to half the Southeast. His terminal sat off Highway 11 near a line of warehouses and fuel tanks that always smelled of diesel and wet concrete. It was the kind of place that looked ordinary from the road, but moved millions of dollars in product every month. After the wedding, Grant offered Ethan a position as night operations supervisor. At the time, I thought it was generous. A father helping his new son-in-law get stable. A family opening a door. That is how it looked from the outside. And I wanted to believe the outside was enough. It was not. The job came with a company phone, a better salary, and invisible strings Ethan did not notice at first. Grant liked to know who was working late. He liked to know which drivers complained. He liked to know whether Nora and Ethan were saving for a house, whether they planned to move closer to him, whether Ethan understood what family he had married into. He never said any of it as a threat. That was Grant's gift. He did not yell. He did not pound tables. He did not turn red in the face like men who need the room to know they are angry. Grant was quieter than that. He wore dark tailored jackets to company dinners, kept his silver hair cut the same way every month, and shook your hand once, firmly, like he was closing a deal instead of greeting a person. When he smiled, it stopped at his mouth. People called him disciplined, professional, old school. I called him cold. And cold men are dangerous because they can hurt you while convincing everybody else they are being reasonable. I did not understand then that Ethan's job was never just employment. It was a leash Grant had placed around my son's life and called opportunity. It happened on a Tuesday, November 5th. I remember the date because the leaves had turned along Cedar Hollow Road, and my wife had been after me to return Ethan's pressure washer before I forgot it in the garage until spring. I had it strapped in the bed of my truck when my phone lit up on the console. 7:12 p.m. Ethan. I almost let it ring. Not because I did not want to talk to my son, but because I was 3 minutes from his apartment, and I figured whatever he needed could wait until I pulled into the lot. Maybe he wanted me to set the washer by the storage closet. Maybe Nora needed the extra house key. Ordinary things. That was the life I thought we were still living. Then I answered. At first, I heard breathing, not words. Breathing. Ethan, I said. You there, Dad? One word. That was all he got out before his voice folded in on itself. I had heard my son hurt before. Broken arm at 14. Bad breakup in college. His grandfather's funeral. This was different. This was a grown man trying to keep control with both hands and losing grip anyway. Dad, I need you to come get me. My foot came off the gas. Where are you? The police station. He swallowed hard enough that I heard it through the line. Market Street. They arrested me. For a second, the road in front of me seemed to stretch too long. Headlights slid past in the other lane. A gas station sign glowed red through the windshield. I kept both hands on the wheel because if I let go, I was not sure what they would do. Arrested for what? Theft. His voice cracked on the word. They're saying I stole from Whitaker. From the company. I pulled onto the shoulder beside a closed tire shop. Gravel popping under the tires. The pressure washer shifted in the truck bed. I put the transmission in park and stared through the windshield. Ethan, listen to me. Did you do this? No. He answered fast. It cut through everything else. Dad, no, I swear to God, I didn't take anything. I don't even know what they're talking about. I believed him. There are moments when a father should ask questions. That was not one of them. Who called it in? Silence. Maybe 3 seconds. But it was the kind of silence that tells you the answer is doing damage before it is spoken. Grant, Ethan said. My chest went quiet. Not my mouth, not my thoughts, my chest. Grant Whitaker. His wife's father. His employer. The man who had stood beside Ethan in wedding photos with one hand on his shoulder like a blessing. The man who had toasted him in front of a room full of people and said family was not blood, it was loyalty. I watched a city bus roll past. Yellow lights spilling across the faces inside. People going home from work. Someone laughing near the back. A woman holding a grocery bag. Ordinary lives moving by while my son's name was being dragged into a criminal record. Dad, Ethan said, smaller now. I'm here. I didn't do it. I know. I don't know what to say to them. You don't say anything else. I told him. My voice had steadied by then. That scared me later. How calm I sounded. But calm was the only useful thing I had to give him. Listen carefully. Do not explain. Do not defend yourself. Do not answer one more question until I get there, or until a lawyer is sitting beside you. You understand me? Yes, sir. He had not called me sir since he was a teenager trying to sound brave after denting my truck. I'm coming, I said. You look at the floor if you have to. But you keep your mouth shut. Then I hung up and turned the truck toward Market Street. By the first red light, I was no longer wondering what happened. I was wondering who had decided my son needed to be destroyed. Here is what I learned in the next several hours, piece by piece, the way bad news likes to arrive. 2 days before Ethan called me from Market Street, a shortfall appeared in Whitaker Cold Chain's fuel accounts. $6,800. Not enough to sink a company, but enough to make a man look dishonest if somebody wanted him to look that way. The money was tied to the refrigerated fleet. The diesel reserves used to keep trailers running cold overnight when loads had to sit before departure. That mattered, because only a small group of supervisors had access to the fuel yard after hours. Ethan was one of them. I found that out from the public defender who sat with us in a room that smelled like old coffee, floor cleaner, and fear. Ethan had both elbows on the table and kept rubbing his palms together like he was trying to scrub something off his skin. They said my code opened the gate, he told me. They said I was there at 3:46 p.m. Were you? He looked at me like the question hurt. Then shook his head. I was in Nashville. That was the first crack in Grant Whitaker's story. Ethan had driven to Nashville that morning for an equipment vendor meeting about replacing 3 failing refrigeration units. He had been in a conference room with 2 sales reps and Whitaker's own purchasing coordinator from 1 in the afternoon until almost 5. He had gas receipts, a parking ticket, calendar invites, and 3 people who could put him 90 miles away from the fuel yard when the company claimed he was stealing from it. But none of that had mattered to Grant. Grant had not called Ethan into his office. He had not asked him where he was that afternoon. He had not pulled the security footage himself. He had not asked payroll whether Ethan was logged as off-site. He had not done the human thing a decent employer does before dragging a man's name into a criminal complaint. Instead, he went to his head of security, Calvin Rusk. Calvin was a former deputy with a shaved head, a thick neck, and the tired confidence of a man who liked policies because policies let him stop thinking. I had met him once at a company picnic. He stood near the grill with his arms crossed, watching people laugh like laughter might violate procedure. According to the complaint, Grant told Calvin to put together the file. That phrase sat wrong with me the moment I heard it. Not review the discrepancy, not find out what happened, put together the file. By the time Ethan was called into the office, the file already had a shape. His access code had opened the fuel yard gate at 3:46. The fuel account was short by $6,800. Ethan had authority over night operations. Ethan had recently asked about overtime adjustments for his crew. Ethan had therefore created motive, access, and opportunity. It was neat. Too neat. That night, after Ethan was processed and his lawyer told us not to make statements to anyone at the company, I stepped outside into the police station parking lot and called Grant myself. He answered on the 3rd ring. Malcolm, he said, as if I had interrupted dinner, not as if my son was sitting behind glass because of him. Grant, I need you to explain what you think you're doing. There is nothing to explain, he said. We discovered a theft. We reported it. You had my son arrested. I reported a crime. You reported your son-in-law. A pause. Then his voice came back as smooth. Family does not exempt a person from consequences. I closed my eyes. Across the lot, Nora was sitting in her car with both hands pressed over her mouth. My wife had an arm around her shoulders. Ethan could not see any of it from inside. And maybe that was mercy. He was in Nashville, I said. You know that. Or you would know it if you had asked one question before calling the police. If Ethan has evidence, he can present it through the proper channels. The proper channels, I said. Grant, you bypassed every proper channel in your own company. I run my company according to policy. No, I said. You run it according to control. For the first time, I heard a change in his breathing. Then he said the sentence that settled everything between us. This is not personal, Malcolm. It is business. Ethan should have read his employment agreement more carefully. There it was. Cold, polished, stupid. He thought the agreement protected him. He thought some clause buried in Ethan's job paperwork gave him power to humiliate my son and call it procedure. I did not tell him he had reminded me of something. I did not tell him there was another agreement. Older than Ethan's marriage. Older than Ethan's job. Sitting in a cabinet he had forgotten existed. I only said, "Be very careful, Grant." He gave a quiet laugh. Then he hung up. The first person inside Whitaker Cold Chain who refused to pretend this was normal was Marlene Hayes. Marlene was 55 years old, ran the front office, and knew more about that company than Grant ever admitted. She had been there before the refrigerated fleet expanded, before the Nashville routes, before Nora was old enough to sit at the reception desk with crayons. If Grant owned the company on paper, Marlene kept it breathing. She was the one who drove Nora to the police station that night. No announcement, no permission, no dramatic speech. She just took her purse from the bottom drawer, told the receptionist to lock up, and walked out before anyone could ask where she was going. When I stepped back into the waiting area after calling Grant, Marlene was sitting beside Nora with one hand wrapped around both of hers. "We take care of our own," she kept saying quietly. "That's what decent people do." I remember that word, decent. It sounded almost old-fashioned in that room, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and my son somewhere behind a locked door because a rich man wanted to make a point. Marlene did not know everything yet, but she knew Grant, she knew Calvin Rusk, and she knew the fuel yard access system because every exception report crossed her desk before it went upstairs. That was the part Calvin had forgotten. Or maybe the part he assumed would not matter because people like him always underestimate women who answer phones and remember everything. The next morning, before most of the office arrived, Marlene pulled 6 months of access records from the fuel yard keypad. She found the flaw in less than 20 minutes. Gate 3 had been malfunctioning for 9 straight days. Not completely failing. That would have been obvious. It was worse than that. The keypad was logging phantom entries at random intervals, assigning old access codes to new timestamps, creating a record that looked official enough to fool anyone who wanted to be fooled. Ethan's code was not proof. It was noise dressed up as evidence. Marlene printed the maintenance tickets, the exception reports, the timestamp errors, and the unanswered service request Calvin had signed off on 4 days before Ethan was arrested. Then, she placed everything in a folder and drove it herself to Ethan's attorney. She did not call Grant. She did not warn Calvin. She did not ask whether she was risking her job. She did the thing Grant had refused to do from the beginning. She looked for the truth. I did not use Marlene's folder right away. That may sound strange. A man has proof in his hands that his son was framed, and you expect him to run with it, slam it on a desk, shout until somebody listens. I understand that. A younger version of me might have done exactly that. But I had spent too many years around men who made mistakes because they were in a hurry to feel powerful. So, I waited. That first night after Ethan came home, he did not go back to his apartment. Nora wanted him to. I think part of her needed him there so the place would not feel like Grant had taken it from both of them. But Ethan stood in our kitchen, still wearing the same wrinkled shirt from the station, and looked at his wedding ring like it had become a question. "I can't sleep there tonight," he said. No one argued. He took the pull-out couch in the den around 3 in the morning. I walked past and saw him awake, staring at the ceiling, one arm over his chest. He looked less like a man resting than a man trying not to disappear. Nora stayed in the guest room with my wife. She did not eat dinner. She did not touch breakfast. She kept checking her phone, hoping her father would send something that sounded like regret, and fearing he would send something that sounded like orders. That was the cruelty of what Grant had done. He had not only accused Ethan, he had split his own daughter down the middle and forced her to choose between the man who raised her and the man she had promised to build a life with. I sat with that for 3 days. I let the anger cool until it stopped burning and started hardening. Because rage is easy. Rage gives a man permission to make noise, break things, say words he cannot take back. Rage is what weak men mistake for strength. What I felt was not rage. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of a door closing inside me. On the 3rd night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold beside Marlene's folder. The house was dark except for the stove light. I opened the folder again, read the reports again, and then I made my decision. I was not mad at Grant Whitaker anymore. I was finished being merciful, and mercy, once withdrawn, does not return easily. There was something Grant Whitaker did not know. Nobody in that family knew it. Not Nora, not Ethan, not even my wife, because there are certain files from a banker's old life that stay sealed unless the world gives you a reason to open them. 12 years earlier, Whitaker Cold Chain Logistics was 6 weeks from dying. Grant would never have admitted it. Of course, men like Grant do not say bankruptcy. They say temporary liquidity pressure. They do not say the bank is about to put a knife to our throat. They say we are evaluating capital options. But I had spent 34 years reading the difference between language and truth. And the truth was ugly. A failed refrigerated meat contract had left Whitaker exposed for almost $500,000. 2 customers had filed claims over spoiled product after trailers went warm during a July heat wave. Their primary lender was tired of extensions, tired of explanations, and ready to call the note. A company like that can look alive right up until the morning it stops breathing. At the time, I was a senior credit risk officer for a regional bank. Whitaker's file crossed my desk through a colleague who wanted a second opinion. I remember sitting in my office after hours, reading the balance sheet, the collateral list, the aging receivables, and the route contracts Grant still had not ruined. The company was wounded, but it was not worthless. It had equipment, it had drivers, it had customer relationships. It had a market that would forgive mistakes if somebody gave the business time to recover. So, I gave it time. Not directly. I was not foolish enough for that. I structured a private note through a holding entity called Cedar Ridge Holdings. Clean paperwork. Quiet ownership. My name nowhere. Grant would see it. The note refinanced the most dangerous piece of debt, bought him breathing room, and kept those trucks moving when they were days from being parked for good. Grant Whitaker never thanked me because Grant Whitaker never knew. That was fine. I had not done it for thanks. Back then, I believed saving a small company meant saving drivers' mortgages, dispatchers' paychecks, warehouse families, people who would never sit across from a banker but would feel every decision one made. The note was not unusual, except for one covenant, Section 37. It was standard language, the kind lawyers bury deep enough that arrogant men sign beside it without feeling the weight. It said that, if the company took material legal action against an employee without documented board review, and that action created reputational, operational, or financial harm, the note holder had the right to declare default and assume interim operational control pending review. Most people would have skimmed past it. Grant had. For 12 years. He paid the note mostly on time, not perfectly, but close enough. Cedar Ridge stayed quiet. I stayed quiet. Section 37 sat in a file cabinet like an unloaded weapon. Legal, patient, forgotten. Until Grant used the police to punish my son. Until he called it business. Until he told me Ethan should have read his agreement more carefully. That was the moment he handed me the match and pointed at his own house. Because Ethan's employment agreement did not matter anymore. Grant's did. And hidden inside the contract that had saved Whitaker Cold Chain was the one sentence that could remove Grant from the very office where he thought he was untouchable. I closed the folder, looked across my dark kitchen, and understood something that almost made me smile. The law did not need anger from me. It only needed the clause Grant had forgotten he signed that night. Grant Whitaker had not just framed my son. He had defaulted on me. I called Arthur Vance the next morning at 8:10. Arthur had been my attorney for 20 years, which meant he knew 2 things about me. First, I did not panic. Second, if I called before breakfast and asked him to pull a commercial note, something had crossed a line. I need the Whitaker cold chain file, I told him. There was a pause long enough for paper to stop moving. Cedar Ridge, he asked. Yes. Is this personal or business? I looked through the kitchen window at Ethan sitting on the back steps in yesterday's clothes, elbows on his knees. Both, I said. But we are going to treat it like business. Arthur exhaled. What happened? Grant Whitaker had my son arrested on a theft complaint he never verified. The evidence appears fabricated. I need you to confirm Section 37 is still enforceable. Confirm whether the company's legal action creates a default event. And prepare every notice exactly by the book. Malcolm, nothing gets stretched, I said. Nothing gets bent. If we move clean. That mattered more than anger did. I did not want revenge that could be dismissed as a grieving father throwing his weight around. I wanted procedure. I wanted signatures. I wanted the law to walk into Grant's office wearing polished shoes. For 2 days, Arthur worked through the note. Amendments, payment history, board records, and default language. He confirmed what I suspected. There had been no documented board review before Grant filed the criminal complaint. There had been no internal inquiry, no written interview with Ethan, no verified footage, nothing except Calvin Rusk's access report and Grant's approval. Meanwhile, Marlene's folder reached Ethan's defense attorney. The fuel yard keypad malfunction records were submitted. The maintenance tickets showed Gate 3 had been generating false entries for 9 straight days. Calvan's initials were on the ignored service request. Then the Nashville alibi came in. 2 equipment representatives and Whitaker's purchasing coordinator signed statements confirming Ethan had been in the vendor conference room from 1:08 p.m. until 4:52 p.m. Parking records matched. Phone location data matched. Even the restaurant receipt from lunch matched. The case against my son did not collapse all at once. It started making noises first. Grant's legal counsel called Ethan's attorney 3 times that Thursday. By Friday afternoon, they had called 9 times. By Monday morning, the county prosecutor's office had received enough messages from Whitaker's side to make a receptionist start writing numbers. 12 calls became 26. 26 became 34. The tone changed with each one. At first, they wanted clarification. Then they wanted delay. Then they wanted to know whether Ethan would consider the matter resolved quietly if the complaint was withdrawn. Ethan's attorney did not answer. Arthur told me not to call the prosecutor. So I did not. I did not call Grant either. I did not call Nora and tell her what I was preparing. I let the machinery turn. 41 calls. That is how many it took before the Hamilton County Prosecutor's Office dismissed every charge against Ethan Mercer for insufficient evidence. 41 calls, and not one of them came from me. By then, Arthur had finished the notices. Grant thought the criminal case was his problem. He was wrong. The criminal case had only opened the door. I walked into Grant Whitaker's office on Thursday, January 15th, at 2:20. Arthur Vance was beside me with a leather folder under his arm. Not a manila folder this time. Leather. Heavy. The kind of detail Grant would notice before he noticed the danger. His office overlooked the terminal yard. Through the glass behind him, I could see refrigerated trailers lined up in clean white rows. Engines humming. Men in safety vests moving between them like none of their paychecks depended on what was about to happen upstairs. Grant looked up from his desk and did not stand. That told me everything. Malcolm, he said. This is unexpected. It shouldn't be. He glanced at Arthur, then at the folder. His expression barely moved, but I saw irritation pass through his eyes like a shadow. I have a board call in 20 minutes. Cancel it, I said. His mouth tightened. You don't give instructions in my office. I sat down anyway. Arthur remained standing beside me. He had that courtroom stillness lawyers get when they know the facts are loaded and the other side has not heard the chamber click. Grant leaned back in his chair. If this is about Ethan, the charges were dropped. The matter is closed. No, I said. The criminal complaint was dropped. The matter is now beginning. For the first time. His eyes narrowed. Careful. Malcolm, I almost smiled at that. Almost. 12 years ago, I said. Whitaker Cold Chain Logistics was 5 weeks from liquidation. Your primary lender was preparing to call the note. Your meat storage contract failed. 2 customers filed claims. And your cash position was worse than your reports admitted. Grant went very still. Not shocked, not yet. Just still. Who told you that? You did, I said. Through your financial statements. His jaw flexed once. I continued. A private note was structured through Cedar Ridge Holdings. It refinanced the dangerous debt and kept your company alive long enough to recover. You never knew who held that note. That is confidential financing history. Not to the note holder. His hand moved toward the desk phone, then stopped. I let the silence sit there. That note holder, I said, is me. Grant stared at me for several seconds. Then he gave a short laugh with no humor in it. That's impossible. Arthur opened the leather folder and placed the first document on the desk. Assignment records, payment history, corporate formation papers, notices, every clean link in the chain. Grant did not touch them at first. Men like Grant like power best when it stays invisible. Once it is paper in front of them, they have to read it like everybody else. Section 37, I said. Material legal action against an employee without documented board review, resulting in reputational, operational, or financial harm. Constitutes a default event. Upon default, the note holder may assume interim operational control pending review. He looked up slowly. You had Ethan arrested on fabricated access data, I said. You skipped board review. You skipped internal investigation. You exposed this company to legal liability because my son married your daughter without kneeling low enough for your taste. That is a lie. No, I said. That is your problem. Arthur slid the remaining documents across the desk. Grant finally picked them up. His hands had always been steady. I had noticed that. Steady when he told me my son's arrest was business, but as he read Section 37, those steady hands began to shake, just slightly. Enough. Effective that morning, Cedar Ridge Holdings had exercised its rights under Section 37. I said it without raising my voice, and somehow that made the room smaller. Grant looked at Arthur. Then, at me. Searching for the gap, the bluff, the weakness men like him are sure exists when they are losing. There was none. Pending review, Arthur said. Interim operational control transfers to the note holder's appointed management representative. Company accounts are frozen except for payroll, insurance, fuel procurement, and approved operating expenses. All records are preserved. Relevant personnel are subject to interview. Grant's face tightened. You cannot freeze my company. I am not freezing your company, I said. The agreement you signed is. That landed harder than shouting ever could have. Arthur placed 2 termination notices. Calvin Rusk is finished, I said, effective immediately. He fabricated evidence in a criminal complaint, ignored a known system failure, and allowed a false report to leave this building with your approval attached to it. Grant said nothing. Your HR director is finished, too. She signed off on an employee being turned over to police without 1 documented interview, 1 internal review, or 1 attempt to verify his location. That will cripple operations. No, I said. It will remove the people who crippled trust. He looked at me then, and I saw something I had not seen before. Not fear. Fear would have been cleaner. This was the beginning of a man realizing the world had rules he did not own. I did what any owner would do, he said. I protected the company. You protected your pride. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. I am not here to burn Whitaker Cold Chain to the ground, I said. Drivers still need paychecks. Customers still need deliveries. Families still need groceries, and medicine moved cold across state lines. This company is bigger than your ego. Grant, I am here to make sure no employee ever goes through what my son went through because you needed someone to kneel. His voice came out thin. He is my son-in-law. I stood. He was your son-in-law when you had him arrested. I buttoned my coat and turned toward the door. I did not gloat. Quiet revenge does not need applause. Ethan's record was cleared the following week. Not softened. Cleared. His attorney received the written dismissal, and Arthur made sure Whitaker issued a correction to every department that had heard about the theft complaint. No careful corporate language, no misunderstanding occurred. The statement said the allegation against Ethan Mercer was unsupported and should never have been advanced. That mattered to me. A man can survive an arrest. Surviving the whispers afterward is harder. 2 weeks later, Marlene Hayes was named general manager of Whitaker Cold Chain. She did not celebrate loudly. She walked into the break room, thanked the drivers, thanked dispatch, and told everyone payroll would still run Friday, and nobody was getting punished for telling the truth. That was leadership. Grant remained a minority partner. He kept shares, an office he rarely used, and the kind of title men receive when people are trying not to say powerless. Operational control was gone. In March, On a Sunday evening, Grant came to Ethan and Nora's house. He stood on their porch with his coat buttoned wrong and apologized. It was not perfect. He protected himself in places. He used careful words when plain ones would have served him better. But he looked Ethan in the eye and said, "I was wrong. Sometimes justice is not a thunderclap. Sometimes it is a proud man saying the sentence he spent his life avoiding." I drove home from Ethan and Nora's house that Sunday night with the windows cracked open. March air in Tennessee has a way of feeling honest. Cold enough to keep you awake. Soft enough to remind you winter is losing. There was an old Alan Jackson song playing low on the radio. And for the first time in months, I did not feel like I was bracing for the next hit. Grant had apologized. Not beautifully. Not fully. He stepped around certain words the way proud men step around graves. But he had stood on my son's porch, looked Ethan in the eye, and admitted he was wrong. For a man like Grant Whitaker, that sentence probably cost him more than money ever could. I thought about the years I spent telling myself that staying out of Ethan's life was respect. A grown son needed room. A father should not hover. A man had to fight his own battles. There is truth in that. But truth can become an excuse when you use it to avoid standing where you are needed. I had mistaken distance for dignity. I had mistaken silence for trust. What I understand now is that loving a grown child is not about controlling his life, and it is not about abandoning him to prove you respect him. It is knowing when to step back and when to step forward without asking for applause. Sometimes love is a phone call answered on the first ring. Sometimes it is sitting in a police station until the lights hurt your eyes. And sometimes it is the contract clause waiting 12 years in a file cabinet until the day your son needs more than comfort. Ethan and Nora are doing well now. They bought a small house outside Maryville with a front porch just wide enough for 2 rocking chairs and a stubborn dog they named Diesel. Ethan works for a different logistics company, one that knows what kind of man it hired. Nora still teaches. Their marriage did not come out untouched, but it came out stronger because they chose each other when choosing was hardest. Marlene Hayes runs Whitaker Cold Chain better than Grant ever did. She calls me every Christmas, usually to complain about drivers, weather, or both. I look forward to it. Grant is around, but quieter. Maybe that is punishment. Maybe that is growth. I do not pretend to know. Every now and then, I think about Section 37, one paragraph, one forgotten signature, one piece of paper that sat untouched for 12 years. Waiting to become the most important thing I ever signed. So, if this story meant something to you, if someone ever stepped in front of you when the world tried to crush you, leave a comment and tell me who that person was. And if you believe quiet fathers can still move mountains, subscribe to Dad's Pure Revenge, because sometimes the loudest justice begins with a whisper.